Hi, everybody. My shirt says, in my defense, I was left unsupervised, which is kind of how I feel a lot when we're talking about meditation specifically. Like, left to my own devices in my head, I tend to run amok a little bit. Like, I can't really focus and hyper focus on nothing, and I can't hyper focus on something. It's like saying, okay, don't think about this finger. Or I only want you to think about this eye, not this, but you know what I'm saying? Like I can't, right? There's just too much going on in my head and left unsupervised. I tend to run far afield. And for me, the best I can do at times is prayer, disciplined prayer, contemplating the words or listening to a guided meditation. But a lot of times, even that guided meditation runs me afoul because I start to think about other weird ass shit. And I do it, and then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh God, am I listening to? Am I supposed to be in mindfulness? I have been completely unmindful of my mindfulness. And what are you talking about? When I'm trying to be mindful, I can't be mindful of the things I'm unmindful about because my mindfulness is deteriorated by the fact that I am not mindful, whatever that means. However, this is what I want to talk about just in the difference between those two. So, interestingly enough, if we look at the steps, really meditation doesn't make its appearance until step 11, right? Because I mentioned before that one of the promises, in fact, the very first one of the step promises, 10 step promises, on page 84 says, we cease fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. And so the idea is that I am in a state of somewhat sedate sanity, right? Like not crazy shithouse running amok kind of like weirdness, and not like so uptight I can't do anything kind of rigidness, right? But I'm sane. Like I'm able to back up the truck out on dysfunctional thoughts and maladaptive behaviors. A lot of times, my actual reactions have changed because I engage in 10 steps, which means I find myself effing up and going, oh man, I can't do that. Let's back the truck up. So I find myself going to people and saying, listen, you know what? I'm sorry I ignored you or I lied to you without even thinking about it or I obfuscated or I ignored you. It's not how I want to be in this relationship and I'm sorry. And so I change my reactions. And so I can get now into a regimen of prayer, which is almost a preemptive reminder, right? It's a contractual analysis between me and my higher power that I need to do my part and God needs to do his part. And I have that expectation that is an integration. It's interesting. If we look at Genesis 1:7, in Hebrew it says, Vayedaber Adonai na'aseh Adam b'tzalmo, which means, and God said, let us create man. Traditionally, in the Jewish mindset, God is speaking to us. I mean, he's not talking to a fish and a cow and three bushes that he created before that. He's talking to humans. He says, let us make man. And in essence, the way that God creates ex nihilo, something from nothing, matter from energy, is the ability to speak it into existence. And so God creates the energy of the universe and turns it into matter through option. That's it. Genesis 1:2, right? And the world was empty and without form, and God said, let there be light. God said it. Whether it's an analogy or a metaphor and an algorithm doesn't even matter. What matters is that this idea of sound precursing the creation of matter is really what it's all about. And listen, there's no conflict with the scientific approach to that either. What do we say all the time? The Big Bang, not the Big Bang, right? Like it's a sound. When I play pool and the cue ball hits the 9 ball, it makes a sound, right? Even Newton's third is a little bit off. It's not equal and opposite. It's nearly, because in the transfer of energy, right? In the inertia going from one to the other, there is a dispulsion. That dispulsion is sound. And when God is all things, creates something limited, it's not something from nothing. It's almost nothing from something. Matter from energy, there has to be a sound. And so when I want to create a reality, when I want to imitate divinity and imitate God and speak to a level of understanding where I can create a reality for myself. The act of vocalization and affirmation and talking into an existence works. I mean, shit, to be honest, I talked myself into getting behind the wheel of a car drunk 1,000 times, leaning on it. It'll be fine. It's only 4 blocks. Who's gonna know? I mean, the police aren't. Like, I talked myself into dumb shit constantly, which means that if it works, without even getting to the neurology, which we will absolutely talk about, what it means is that I can actually talk myself into doing smart things the same way I talk myself into doing dumb shit for years. For years. And it's weird because our default reaction without conscious thought is to speak to ourselves. I mean, how many times do we talk to ourselves when shit's going sideways? I can't tell you how many times I've been behind the wheel of a car, literally. And all of a sudden, the first thing out of my mouth is, dude, you are way too fucked up to be driving right now. And that's the kind of shit that would happen. So if it works in reaffirmation of nonsense, I would imagine it works in reaffirmation of things that are positive and even things that haven't happened yet. Because what I can do is I can generate a desire and a manifest of those things. And because I'm untrustworthy, because in my defense I was left to my own devices and things went sideways, it's a lot helpful for me to have a liturgical approach, right? And basically the difference is that liturgy comes from the word literary. It's written, it's fixed, it's dynamic, yet in the same way. Because in the same way that I'm not so trustworthy meditating, when I freestyle in prayer, I can get lost as well. So I like to bookend it with something written. And I don't memorize it. Listen, I know the third step prayer by heart. I can sit here and go, God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thy will. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help. Of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life, may I do thy will always. I can say that all day long. But if I say it at that rapid pitch, I don't really know what I'm saying. And I don't contemplate it, and I don't let the words resonate on in my head, but in my mouth, in my ears, and back in my head. And that's really the cycle of prayer, which is why we see that prayer in community with a common unity of sound and tonality and resonance reinforces. I think the thought, I say the thought, I hear the thought, I think the thought, I say the thought, I hear the thought, I think the thought, which creates a dynamic we know in science of what's called polypeptide growth, right? Synaptic plasticity used to be called neuroplasticity. You know, I remember Al Franken in Saturday Night Live doing that Stuart Smalley in the mirror. You're good enough. You're nice enough. And gosh darn it, people like you. And it was all that 70s let's hug community, go to group therapy nonsense, you know. But the fact of the matter is, what we know today with the advent of fMRIs and the way we have imaging technology, that these things are developmentally sound. And we know for a fact also on the neurological end of the spectrum that neurons that fire together wire together to create a network, not a line, a network of things. In fact, search on YouTube in this particular app the idea of visualization or actual film of neurons growing together. It's fascinating. And we reaffirm that by doing it. And so if I can develop that neurology by praying, how much better? So what's the difference? Well, I ask people all the time, do you pray? And they say, oh yeah. And I say, well, do you pray out loud? And they go, no, I do it in my head. And my God knows the difference. And I'm like, that is correct. Your God does know what you think and know what you say. But there's something to be said about the affirmation of that partnership. God knows, but does he physically intervene to tell me, hey, stop that shit. That's not your job. That's my job. Or do I need to reiterate the terms of the contractual agreements that I have with God? And is that a verbal contract? And if I am prone to run amok and not pay attention to the parameters of a verbal contract, is it not important for me to say it out loud over and over again and remind myself the shit that is my business and the shit that is none of my business. What is my job and what is the job of the higher power? My big homie, my partner in my own self development. That's really the important idea, right? And so that's what I try to do. So I say, listen, I get it. God understands you praying in your head, but that is meditation, right? And meditation is different than prayer. And we know it scientifically, but in the traditional religious and spiritual realms of discipline, we have always known the difference. In fact, what can be said with somewhat accuracy would be that prayer is a ask and meditation is a receive. That means I speak and then I listen. I speak and then I listen. And there's something to be said about prayer, right? In fact, if we go back to the third step prayer in the big book on page 63, after the prayer in the very next paragraph, there's a small little blurb, one sentence of direction on how to pray. It says the wording was, of course, quite optional, as long as we express the idea, voicing it without reservation. And I'm not saying that praying silently is bad. I'm just saying that maybe it's not technically prayer. Maybe it's meditation, which is really, really good. But because I suck at meditation, maybe I need to say the words out loud to keep myself on track. And go back to that idea on page 63, where Bill says the wording was, of course, quite optional. Well, of course. Not a little, not maybe it's optional, like, ooh, it might be. No, of course that shit is optional. Say what you mean what you say. Don't say it mean. These are important parameters for interpersonal relationships, whether it's with divinity or my next door neighbor or the dude at my home group who won't stop sharing about the same shit every week.